A little ways out of Leeds city center, you've got the home where Peter Sutcliffe grew up in, and the home is still lived in by his ex-wife, someone who married finally 2 years ago and who, for the last 2 years of his life, didn't visit Sutcliffe. Here you see it guarded by two police officers as it was after he was being arrested, and it's amazing to think that she still lives in there, or at least lived in there up until 2019. As we drive down the road, we head towards the smaller community of Bingley, where Sutcliffe worked for a good period of time as an undertaker. And if you enter in the Bingley City Cemetery, weirdly enough, it takes you across the road and over the medieval bridge there in the distance that you can see. But on the opposite side of the river is the city cemetery where he worked and where he claimed to have developed his schizophrenia. Now, I don't believe any of these claims of schizophrenia at all. Sutcliffe was a terrible man, and all he wanted to do was kill women because he was uncomfortable with himself and his personality, and he needed mental help. But he wasn't schizophrenic. He wasn't hearing the voice of God. He only said that to fit into the police narrative. And this is another killer, Mike Roantree, who was born in the same area of Bingley and was raised there. He was an upper class student, an upper class kid, and he decided to just go out because a woman had rejected him and start spree killing. And he killed four people, I believe a couple and two others, in a weird bid to kind of get a high score from late 1975 to early 1976, and he got put away fairly quickly. They caught him pretty fast because he was a bright star that burned very quickly. But this is back to Bingley Cemetery, where Sutcliffe worked for a while, and getting a little bit more into detail, he claimed to have developed schizophrenia while working on the graves, and he saw the grave of a Polish man, and he claimed he heard a muffled noise coming from under the ground. As he put his ear close to the ground, he heard the voice telling him it was the voice of God and that he was tasked with killing prostitutes. Now, I believe, and this is the grave here of the Polish man, I believe that Sutcliffe completely made this story up. He wanted the cops to think he was insane, when in reality, he was just a bitter person who wanted to kill prostitutes. And here are some more Sutcliffe graves. Now, Sutcliffe, found it very interesting, is a name pretty confined to the mid-England or upper England, Yorkshire areas. The Sutcliffes are a pretty famous family, and if you look into them, not related to Peter Sutcliffe, but a lot of them are boxers and workers, and I believe some of them are even in the Beatles. It's almost like the kind of clan structure that you would see in Scotland with the Armstrongs, but more in upper central England. But here we're driving into downtown Leeds a bit, and you can see this is the kind of area where Sutcliffe would have been roaming around a little bit, looking for women as it got darker at night. And his MO would be to park a car on the side of the road near a pub. And if a woman looked to be a sex worker, he would approach them and proposition them, or they would get in the car and he would attack them with a hammer or with a knife and degrade the body and leave it. And the police were doing a horrible, horrible job because it started with sex workers because the police didn't really care to look into sex worker crimes. And then it went over to regular women or just ordinary women going about their day. And the police would always insinuate that these were sex workers and just do a terrible job of investigating. But here we're heading to an interesting area called Roundhay Park. And it was used for the murder of Irene Richardson. And the actual first attempted murder here was that of Marcella Claxton. And Sutcliffe tried to murder her, but kind of didn't go through with it. He hit her over the head with a hammer, and she crawled over to a phone booth. And immediately after hitting her in the head, Sutcliffe just ran. But he went through with it with Irene Richardson, and it was a very, very sad murder because it took place also in the shadow of the apartment used for Jimmy Savile. And he had a beautiful kind of flat at the very top of there that overlooked it. And now, looking back on it, a lot of commentators say that Savile and Sutcliffe may have had a deviant relationship. Savile would often visit Sutcliffe in Broadmoor Hospital, and these are the scenes of the murder that took place. These would be taken basically from Savile's driveway. Savile absolutely saw it, and Savile interacted quite a bit with Sutcliffe. We know that they hung out, and we know that Savile went for hours and hours, very often, to go visit Broadmoor and give him tea and help make sure that he met a boxer, Sutcliffe was really interested in boxers, and this is Savile himself sitting in the apartment. You can see the trees right behind him where Irene Richardson was murdered, and it's believed by some that, well, he kind of propositioned Sutcliffe to commit these murders and watched as a fly on the wall. And as she was murdered, the police went right over to his apartment because he was known to frequent sex workers, and they took a mold of his teeth. They expected him. They suspected him a little bit, and they took a mold, and they never made this available to the public. And Savile most likely at least knew what was happening, and at least they say that they believe that he knew Sutcliffe before the murders were ever committed, which I think it's a terrible thing that we've never gotten the chance to ask Sutcliffe properly. Did you know Savile, and what kind of crimes did you commit with Savile's knowledge, and could Savile have prevented this? And I think it's sad that this never really went anywhere, the investigation. And the last place that I went to go see was the grave of Yvonne Pearson here in the cemetery just to the east of Leeds. And this was on a different day. It was a lot colder that day. And as we walked through the cemetery, just as an interesting side note, there's a lot of Polish and even Ukrainian military graves, uh, exiles from World War II, reflecting the changing community after the war. And buried in a pauper's grave is Yvonne Pearson at the very end there. She was a woman who went out. I believe she was a sex worker, but she was murdered by Sutcliffe, and she's kept in a mass grave. These are the paupers' graves in the very very back of the cemetery. And as we go and see these sites, I really do reflect on the terrible terrible way that these women were treated by the media. And even being a normal person out walking on the streets, there were women walking the streets just as ordinary people enjoying their day, and the police defamed their characters, saying they were sex workers. Not that there's anything even wrong with being a sex worker, but basically to diminish their lives and say that they didn't need to investigate.